Amen, and happy Father's Day. Welcome to church. Thanks for being at Grace City today. It has been a crazy few days in the city, and I know we had many families that have been affected by these storms over the last couple of days. Some of you guys are still without power, and if that's the case, then we can do anything to help you as a church. Man, let us help you. I feel like we've been leaning in on what it means to be a family as a church. And yet, I feel like we're missing an opportunity if somebody's not like staying in the house of somebody else. So I'm just going to put this out there. My family's leaving for Texas on Tuesday. If you need a place to stay for about 10 days and don't mind a demon-possessed dog, you're more than welcome to stay at my house, all right? I got AC. I got a great clubhouse in the backyard for for your kids, and it's a great time. But let us know if we can do anything for you, and thanks for being here. Thanks for loving on each other. And please let us pray for you and help you out with anything that you might have going on. I alluded to the Playhouse because not this last week, but the week before last was my daughter's 6th birthday. And a few months before her birthday, she told my wife and I that for her birthday, she wanted a new playhouse. She wanted like a clubhouse, someplace where she can go in the backyard and kind of play and have fun and do all sorts of things. And so I got excited about that. You know, I immediately started thinking, what am I going to build for my daughter? Am I going to go like with the old like kit from Lowe's? Am I going to order something? Am I going to splurge on like a rainbow set? Like my backyard's not really big. And so I was just kind of thinking about stuff. And I got this crazy idea that I'm just going to kind of go off course a little bit, and I'm going to design and build my own. Like, I'm just going to do it myself. And I wasn't starting from complete scratch, to be perfectly honest. I have a good friend, one of my best friends growing up, who built a similar style clubhouse for his kids about 10 years ago. And he built it off of kind of this model that we used for houses that we used to build on mission trip. And so I'm familiar with that structure and kind of the dimensions and things. But of course, because he's my best friend, I had to build mine bigger than his. And so I remember sitting down about a month ago and kind of sketching out the plans for this. And I took a 9th grade drafting class, so I felt like I was equipped, you know. But I was spent a lot of time, almost all the time that I wasn't working a week ago, I was in my backyard building this clubhouse. And most of that time was spent with my father-in-law, Lewis, who attends our church, and my son, Zeke. And it was really fun to kind of spend that time with them. Kincaid came over like in the nick of time on Thursday because I was about to lose my mind at the Madison Lowe's. And he just kind of kept me cool and like kept Zeke, you know, at bay, like, don't see your dad like this, he's about to cuss, you know. And so I was very thankful for Kincaid that night. But the cool thing about spending that time with my son and my father-in-law is I got to just tell stories. And my father-in-law is an engineer, so that also helped because I have a degree in public relations. So like when I ran into something where like my design didn't quite fit, he's like, well, we can retrofit this. And I was like, okay, perfect. And so he came in clutch a few times. But we were telling stories. I was telling a story about my wife and my sister talking about my wife's husband and me and just kind of comparing, contrasting. Matt's an Eagle Scout. And again, I was a band nerd turned public relations guy, law school thrown in there, you know. And so I was telling these stories, and Lewis, my father-in-law, was like, well, what gave you the thought that you could design and do this on your own? And he wasn't like saying it in any kind of disparaging way. Like he was there and he saw the plans. He thought I had a good plan to go in. And I said, well, honestly, you know, my dad involved me in a lot of things growing up. Like I feel like whatever skills I have to build something, I actually gained through like building things with my dad. And what I was referring to was many times growing up, my father and I would build things together. The first thing I remember building with my dad was a bike ramp. So I don't know if you have any of these memories, but I used to like jump in my bike off of different things. And I would always just take like a random like picket that had fallen off, you know, the fence and put it on top of like 3 bricks or whatever. And it's like the skinniest, flimsiest bike ramp ever. And going over my handlebars a few times before my dad was like, hey, you know what? We should like build you a bike ramp. And so I remember the very first thing we built was a bike ramp. We got some plywood and some 2x4s, and I paid for the whole thing myself. Like all the wood cost me like $12. You know, I mean, like we're talking the 1980s here. So you know what I'm saying. But like we built it together and it was so much fun. But as we got older, my dad was a band director. My mom was a public school teacher. We didn't have a lot of like extra money for like splurging on vacations and things. And so like you and many others, they would kind of do the side hustle thing so that they could take us to places like Disney World or take us to Ohio to see my aunt and uncle and my cousins there. And so during the summer, when my dad wasn't teaching or band directing, he had about 6 weeks in the summer where he wasn't doing any of that. He would put roofs on people's houses. He would build fences for them. He would do different things and make some extra money so that we could take these vacations. And as I got older, like I started out just being the guy that would like, he'd throw the old, you know, shingles down and I'd pick them all up and put them in a pile. And as I got older, he'd like, hey, get up here. And I'm slinging a hammer and like we're literally putting roofs on houses, building these picket fences. I built a chain link fence, I think, when I was about 13 years old. So I know how to do that now. which is super cool. But I was thinking about my dad as I was telling these stories to my father-in-law and just considering the fact that my dad never missed an opportunity to invite me into like something he was doing. And it's through that I gained so many of the skills and the experience and like the know-how to do so many different things that I know how to do in my life. It came from not just watching my dad do it, but being alongside my dad as he was doing it and being invited in, which of course is this beautiful picture of what we're talking about today, which is discipleship. You see, for 3 weeks we've been talking about these different dynamics that God has built in to the fabric and the DNA, the skeleton of the family. That these are not things that we need to add in. These aren't things that we should, consider. These are things that God built into the structure of families and into the structure of our church as he sees it as a family of faith. And so 2 weeks ago, we started talking about this through the lens of the word direction. And what does it mean to provide direction? What is the need we have to provide direction in our families and in our church as a family? And what we saw was that God's design from the building with Abraham and his family, would that be his family and the nation that came out of that, would provide direction for every other family and every other nation so that they could point the way toward God, that we see that in our families now. And so we have this need in our nuclear families for moms and dads to come together and to say, this is the course we are setting. This is our true north. This is the path that we're going to be on. And that's very practically setting some priorities and values and saying, these are the things that are going to be most important to us as a family. We're always going to hold these, not just in high regard, but as ultimate. These are the things that guide and direct us as a family. And as a church, your church leaders, your elders, your staff, others who are church leaders here at the church, we owe the church at large that same kind of responsibility, that we chart the course. We let you know this is our mission. This is who we think God has called us to do. This is how we all get unified and on the same page. And so we talked about the importance of that. And then last week, we talked about discipline. And of course, what you see the Bible teaches about discipline is that it's God's response or God's answer to what happens when we get off course. If we've set a course in direction, then obviously we're all kind of wayward and we wander and we're broken and we have different views of things. And so we get off course. Even sometimes the course we set, we get off that course. And so discipline is everything that God has designed in our lives to align us back with that course that we have set, to bring us back onto the path that he has charted for us. And we see that with teaching. We see that with correction. We see that with discipleship, as we'll talk about today. And there is at times a need for some punitive or some negative consequences so that when your children do something wrong, they know that there are certain consequences or maybe even punishments that come along with that. But discipline is so much broader than punishment, as we saw last week. Well, that leaves today with the third, which is really, I don't want to say it's the most important, but this is the one that I think we should focus on as a church, and one we will focus on as a church as we move forward. And what I'm talking about, of course, is this idea of discipleship, right? This is the word that we're going to focus on for today. And when I'm talking about discipleship, I want to define for you what I mean by that, because a disciple is a follower, it's a learner, it's a pupil, and discipleship is anything that we do to help that person or to form that person into the master that they are apprenticing under. But as we think about it in a kind of a Christian worldview and through a biblical lens, I think a great definition, it's a long definition, but a great definition for discipleship is laboring in the life of someone else with the intention of sharing your life and God's truth in such a way as to see that person become more like Jesus and committed to doing the same in the lives of others. Now think about that for a second. I didn't come up with this on my own, by the way. There's kind of a lot of different things that people have written, a lot of things that the Bible says. I think this is the best kind of all-encompassing definition that we're going to work with today, and it's certainly not perfect. But think about it. We're laboring in the life of someone else. In other words, there's an element of discipleship that says, I'm going to work. I'm going to do something that's going to feel laborious at times. Okay, like this isn't all going to be easy. This is all going to be smooth. There's going to be some element of what I'm committing to do that means I'm going to work. There's an intent behind what I'm going to do. And the intention is sharing your life and God's truth in such a way as to see that person become more like Jesus. I'm sharing my life. I'm inviting them to experience life with me, right? In church, we have this catchphrase, we do life together. This is what we're talking about, that we experience the ups and downs and all of the things that we go through with someone else with the intention that as we do this together, and we become more like Jesus, they become more like Jesus because they become more like us as we're becoming more like Jesus, right? And so we share our life. We give them a front row pass, a backstage pass, this all access pass to our life so they see us go through all of this. And we're sharing God's truth in every way, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, so that they become more like Jesus, and then they pick up on the blessing and the benefit of doing this, and they understand they now have responsibility to do this in the life of somebody else. Not that we ever reach a finish line, it's like, okay, I'm cutting the cord, you're ready to go, but that they take up this mantle of responsibility to start making disciples for themselves. And so this is the definition we're working with, and we're going to get to a couple places in Scripture today. Really, we all take this from maybe one of the most popular passages in Scripture, the Great Commission, right? This is the mandate that God has given us as the church. Matthew 28, starting in verse 18, in verse 19, Jesus says to them, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything I have commanded. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." So before leaving earth, after his resurrection, before Acts 1 describes him going back up into heaven, Jesus has a collective gathering of his disciples, people who had made it their life's work to follow him, to become more like him. And he says, this is now your job. He makes it very clear that making disciples is the responsibility of a Christian. And what he uses is this particular phrase, as we see right here. He says, make disciples of all nations. Now, I'm going to get a little geeky with you and go Hebrew for just a second. Greek for just a second. We're New Testament. Because this word right here is this Greek word that is mathetuo. Okay, that's the best way I can say it. I butchered it, all right? But go look it up for yourself. Google it. It's fantastic, all right? I can spell it. I just can't say it. So mathetuo. And what it means is, it has a parallel meaning. And this is fascinating to me. Because this really drives home the idea that there is no such thing as a Christian who's not a disciple. In fact, the word disciple, which is mathetes, is used 264 times. The word for Christians used 3 times. So when you talk about Christians or somebody who's following Jesus, it's always in the New Testament referred to as a disciple, a pupil, a learner, or a follower of Jesus, all right? But what he's saying here with this mathetuo, which is another word that's kind of related to that disciple, right, is it's 2 things. It's either becoming a disciple, like the act of learning and becoming more like something, or the forming, making generation of something. So it's either not necessarily a passive, but like this is something that I'm submitting to, something that I'm going through myself, or something that I'm actively working at to help somebody else become. In fact, that phrase can be used in both of those ways. And you have to look at the context of all the words around it to know which one the author is talking about. So here, we know he's saying to make disciples, because he says to make disciples of all nations. And Matthew wouldn't be saying, or Jesus wouldn't be saying, rather, you should become a disciple or a follower of all nations. That's not what he's saying. He's saying to go to all nations and make disciples. However, if you want to geek out with me for about 30 more seconds, if you turn back one chapter, Matthew chapter 27, Jesus is being buried after he died on the cross. And what the gospel writer says is that he was buried in the tomb of a man named Joseph of Arimathea, right? And Joseph of Arimathea was a wealthier man who already had this particular grave that Jesus was buried in. And as the gospel writer is describing Joseph, he says, Joseph of Arimathea, who had become a disciple of Jesus. And he uses the exact same phrase. The context, become a disciple, that mathetuo, was used. And so here's what I'm saying. Even in the word itself is built in this understanding that to be a disciple, to become a disciple, comes with the responsibility of then turning around and making a disciple. That you can't separate the two. That to be a disciple is to also be a disciple maker. To have that burden, to have that responsibility. It's not an optional thing. It's not like, I'm going to become a disciple and maybe I'll make disciples. Jesus' intent is that as we become more like him, we then understand our responsibility to help others do the exact same thing. And this has parallel tracks. It tracks both in the family and in our church as a family, as we've talked about for the last couple of weeks. So let's think about the family for a second and look at a verse we looked at last week. Remember, we were talking about fathers, and we were talking about discipline and the way we administer discipline. We're not supposed to make them any madder than they're already going to be because they're being disciplined. Paul writes to the Ephesians, says, Father, Don't stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. The burden of a father is to bring their children up in the training and instruction of the Lord, to disciple them, to make them followers of Christ. And 2 weeks ago, Matt did a great job of pointing out this particular passage, Deuteronomy 6, as Moses is kind of saying, this is the great command. This is the most important thing to the Israelites as they're kind of wandering through and getting ready to make their way into the promised land. He said, listen, Israel, Shema, right? Do I have your attention? Focus in. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. The great commandment that Jesus says again and kind of doubles down on in the New Testament. These words that I am giving you today are to be in your heart. This is the most important thing, is to love God with everything you have. But then he continues, they're so important that I want you to repeat them to your children. Talk about them when you sit in your house, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Let them be a symbol on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your city gates. Right? Matt did a great job of kind of going into more detail about what this verse actually means, but I want to point out a couple things. That if following God is the most important thing that we can do with our life, then passing this faith on to our children as parents is right below it. Right? If our faith, if making the decision for ourselves to say, God, with my intellect, with my emotions, with the talents that you've given me, with the resources you've given me, if the most important thing is that everything I have, I see as something that I give back to you or use to worship you, then the very next most important thing is that I understand that I need to pass on this same commitment to others, that I need to demonstrate with my life, with my words, and with everything that I do, that this is important so that they might pick up on that and adopt that same posture themselves. It's also a great indication that discipleship never stops. In fact, go back through this real quick, and Matt talked about this, but repeat them to your children. And look at what he says. He says, talk about them when you sit at your home. When you're home, talk about them. This is the one thing you should do. Talk about it when you walk along the road. When you get out of the house, this is the most important thing you do. Talk about it when you lie down, when you're putting your kids to bed. Talk about it. Talk about it when you get up first thing in the morning. You're talking to them. You're giving them their toaster strudel for breakfast. This is the thing that should be on the forefront of your mind, on the tip of your tongue. Every opportunity you have to be with your kids, make sure that you are modeling this, teaching this, and instilling this in them, right? Bind them as a sign on your hand. Do something where it's visible. Let them be a symbol on your forehead. Write them on the doorpost of your house so that anyone who enters your home knows this is what's most important to us. And I think what I like about those last kind of 4 verses there is it's a great reminder that as a parent, discipleship never really stops. It never really stops. Like, discipleship's not something that like we choose to do. If you're a parent and you have kids in your house, discipleship is something you're doing. Like, you are actively forming your children in one way or another into something or another, and that thing that they're being formed into is greatly dependent on the way you live your life, whether that is a life of faith or a life of something else. As a parent, you are always discipling when your kids are around. So your life of love, your life of faith, the way you treat one another, it's best modeled at home because kids learn the most from watching. They learn the most from watching their big brother and big sister. They learn the most from watching their friends at school, but they learn the most from you because you have this unique gift and responsibility and blessing of being their parent. And here's the thing. I wish I could say that like our kids ministry and student ministry are so great that you can kind of outsource this to them. And I believe strongly in like, in Alexa and her ministry. I believe strongly in Kincaid and Macy. Like, I've got so many stories to tell from this last week at youth camp. I'm so incredibly thankful and proud of the team that we have and the volunteers that went this week. Like, your kids are in good hands while you're in here or when you send them off with us. But the truth is, like, they cannot replace you. Like, this is not something to be outsourced or delegated to somebody else. Reed Church has shown that while your faith community is very important, it will never be the most influential thing in the life of faith of your children. The home is the most powerful setting for a child to learn about God, who God is, and to make that decision for themselves. And so one of the things that would be a very practical conversation to have with your kids, if your kids are anywhere around 7, 8 years old, maybe even younger, depending on like how with it and curious they are about God, is to ask them a question. What if you asked your kids this question? What is one thing we can do better as parents to help you know God more? Like, my parents never asked me this question, but I think it's a fascinating question. Like, what is it that I can do that would help you? Another way about, what are you curious about? What do you have doubts about? Like, what do you wonder about? Like, Maggie and I have had, like, multiple conversations about heaven and heavenly bodies. Like, she's fascinated with, like, what heaven's going to be like. And I am, too. I just don't have any good answers, you know? I mean, like, so we just kind of dream together. Like, we kind of brainstorm. Like, what is a heavenly body going to be like? And, like, sometimes she's like, it's going to be a fluffy body, and it's going to have scales. I mean, it's like, it's crazy. I don't know. I don't know what it's going to be like. It's going to be heavenly. It's going to be amazing, you know? But, like, it'd be a great thing to have this conversation with kids, because what you're doing is you're letting them know, like, listen, I want you to be everything you want to be. I want you to be smart, and I want you to be happy, and I want you to have friends. I want you all that. I want you to learn how to drive and make good decisions. But, like, the most important thing to me is that you come to know that God can be trusted, that God loves you, that Jesus died for you, and that your best experience on this earth comes after you've made the decision to follow Jesus, to surrender your life to him, to say, God, be my God. Right? So this is the model for the home, but it's also the model for the church. And we know this because look at what Peter says to the elders, what he says to church leaders in 1 Peter chapter 5. He says, I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder. I was a witness to the sufferings of Christ as well as to one who shares in the glory about to be revealed. So Peter's saying, I got some skins on the wall, right? Like, I was with Jesus. You remember that whole denial story? Yeah, that was me, all right? Like, I've had some down moments. I've had some up moments. Think about the platform that Peter has to write to church leaders in this first century. But here's what he says. To church leaders, to the elders among you, shepherd God's flock among you. Shepherd them. They are now your responsibility. In the same way that the sheep are the responsibility of the shepherd to protect, to guide, to nourish, to direct, all of the things that a shepherd is responsible for a sheep, those who are in your church, those who are part of your faith community, they are now your responsibility. And so he continues. He says, shepherd God's flock among you, not overseeing out of compulsion but willingly, as God would have you, not out of greed for money but eagerly, not lording it over those entrusted to you, not in some kind of power trip way, but rather being examples to the flock. It is your responsibility to set the example for them, to invite them into your life, to shepherd them as a shepherd does with the sheep. I mean, here's how you could tell who somebody was a shepherd. They smelled like sheep. And why do they smell like sheep? Because they spent time around sheep. Like, if somebody doesn't smell like sheep, I can almost guarantee you they're not a shepherd, right? It's like if somebody doesn't smell like motor oil, I know they don't work at Jiffy Lube, you know? I mean, like, there's just something natural that comes with that, right? If you don't smell like suntan lotion, you're not a lifeguard. Like, that's just how it works. And so you know that because they spend time with their sheep. You cannot shepherd them unless you are present with them. And that's exactly what Peter's encouraging them to do. Spend time with them, watch over them, care for them, direct them, disciple them. And it starts with being a great example. Paul writes to Titus in Titus chapter 2. In chapter 2, he kind of lays out this design for older men leading younger men, for older women discipling younger women. This is all built into the fabric and the DNA of who the church was to be. And if you look at all of the things that the New Testament says about discipleship, about passing on the faith, I think you can only come to one conclusion, and that is this: that discipleship is the highest calling, the core identity, and the central task of the church. The discipleship is the highest calling. This is the most important thing. It is the core identity. It is the thing that we should be known for. And it is the central task of the church, which means we cannot try and fit discipleship into everything else that we're doing. We don't look at our kids ministry or our student ministry or our college ministry or our small group ministry or our outreach ministry and say, where can we fit in some discipleship? Like, where does discipleship fit into all of this? If we're asking that question, we're coming with a complete wrong idea to begin with. Every single one of those ministries, every other thing that we do starts with the core purpose being discipleship. That we would pass on this faith by modeling it and by inviting others in to live life with us. There are great biblical examples of this. Even before Jesus came, you had people that were discipling others. They were discipling into the same kind of faith and hope they had in the one who is to come. So if you go back to Exodus and Numbers, you see this amazing story of Moses and Joshua. You know, Joshua took the mantle from Moses and led the Israelites into the promised land. But he didn't get there. God just didn't create a natural-born leader who was ready to do it when he stepped out of the womb. It was all the time that he spent with watching Moses lead and helping Moses lead that developed Joshua into the man that he needed to be to lead those Israelites. You skip over a couple more books, and you're going to see in 1 Samuel this picture of discipleship where Samuel and Eli, the priest, remember Samuel was this gift from God to his mother, and she was so overwhelmed with this gift that God had given that she dedicated him back to the Lord and literally dropped him off at the temple and said, hey, Eli, he's yours. and allowed him to be brought up and trained and discipled and really fathered in a way by Eli to be developed into the kind of prophet that he needed to be, to lead in that particular time at that particular place. But we also see this in the New Testament, around the other side of the cross and the resurrection. And maybe the greatest example in the New Testament, outside of what Jesus did as the OG discipler, was with Paul and Timothy. Right? That story starts in Acts chapter 16. Paul's second trip through where Timothy grew up. He grew up in a town called Lystra. You should read it for yourself. But as Paul's making his way through Lystra, by the way, the first time he came through Lystra, he got in some trouble. In fact, he was almost stoned to death. So Paul was probably pretty notorious in Lystra, and Timothy had probably heard those stories. But on his second trip through, he met Timothy, and he said, Timothy, I want you to come with me. He picked Timothy and said, I want you to come with me. Come and go with me, and let me show you. And then, of course, we know that Timothy became a church leader, and Paul wrote letters to Timothy. That's what we have as 1st and 2nd Timothy, so that he could take on the mantle and start doing the same thing himself. So in the home and the church, we have this responsibility to keep our eyes on Christ, because if we're making disciples, we know that they're going to become no greater than the follower of Christ that we are. And we saw that a couple of weeks in a different series, but we looked at this verse, Luke chapter 6, verse 40. Jesus said this to his disciples. He said, a disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like his teacher. Consider who you are learning from. Jesus is encouraging them. Consider who that greatest voice of influence is in your life. But also, consider who you are forming, and consider what they are becoming like. Because they're become more like the person you see in the mirror than they are anything else. If you have that greatest voice of influence in the life of another, you can be sure that you are the picture that they're looking to. You are the model that they are becoming more like. Jesus is reminding you of this beautiful picture of discipleship where we're becoming more like Christ. And as we do so, those who are making disciples of Christ are becoming more like us. It's the confidence that gave Paul the audacity in 1 Corinthians 11 to say, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Like, who would say something like that? Except for someone who just knows that, like, this is my goal, to be more like Jesus. By the way, Paul did not consider himself a perfect follower of Christ. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 or 3, he says, hey, when I was with you, remember how weak I was? Remember how many sufferings I had? Remember how my words were not filled with any wisdom whatsoever? Like, I was terrible at speaking. In fact, it was only the wisdom of Christ and the power of Christ that made it possible for me to accomplish what happened while I was with you. And so Paul was the first to say, I am not perfect at this, but I am trying to become more like Christ. And because I know that this is the great pursuit of my life, you should imitate me because I'm becoming more like him. So if Jesus is the end goal, if we're trying to share life and share God's truth so that people become more like Jesus, he's not just the end goal, but he's also the model. He's the paradigm for discipleship. He created discipleship. If he's God, he created it before he even stepped into earth as the Son of God, Jesus, on this earth. But if he created it, then we should look at how Jesus made disciples. And I think insight into one story about how he called the first disciples gives us at least 3 practical things that we see about how Jesus made disciples. So let's read it together. This is taken from Matthew chapter 4. Matthew 4, verses 18 through 20. You might be familiar with this story, but this is Jesus calling the disciples. It says, as he was walking along the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon, who we know of as Peter, and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. So this sets the scene. Jesus walking along the Sea of Galilee, Simon and Andrew, Peter and Andrew out in the boat. They're fishermen. That's what they're doing. He sees them out there. He's walking and he sees them. Follow me, he told them, and I will make you fish for people. Immediately they left their nets and they followed him. Right? These 3 verses. Now, this isn't the end-all, be-all of Jesus' discipleship model, but I think this gives us great insight into at least 3 things we know about how Jesus made disciples. And the first thing that it shows us is that Jesus was very intentional in making disciples. What I mean by this, if you look at that, where he was no accident. Having seen them was no accident. He personally chose them to be his disciples. In the same way that he has invited each and every one of us to be adopted into his family, it was by no accident that you received your invitation to be a part of God's family. He chose them. He was intentional. But he wasn't just intentional in choosing them, he was also very intentional with clearly telling them what his intentions for that relationship were. He said, if you follow me, I will make you fish for people. I will make you fishermen. I will make you fishers of men. So he was clear with his intentions after being very intentional with his selection. The second thing that we see is that he was relational. His invitation was follow me, come and go with me. I want you to share life with me. So he invited them into his life, but he also invited them to be his partners in ministry. When he says follow me, he's saying come with me. And he says this because he's going to commit lots of time. We think about 3 years. He's going to commit to being their friend, not just their mentor, but someone who loves them. Right? It's something that gives him in John 13 and John 15 the platform to say, here's what I want you to do. I want you to love others as I have loved you. So when he calls these two upon first meeting them, he knows in the back of his mind, I'm going to spend time with them and I'm going to love them. And I'm going to love them so well that when I'm getting ready to leave, I'm going to be able to say to them, I want you to love other people the way you have seen me love them. That's the kind of intentionality. That's the kind of relational investment that Jesus was willing to make. So he was intentional, and it meant to be relational. If we think about the first week with direction, and whereas with direction, we live our life in such a way, we chart a course, we hope that we live it in a genuine way, in an effective way, so others go, oh my gosh, what do you have that I don't have? And we can point the direction toward God. And with directions, we say to someone, this is the way. This is the way to abundant life. This is the way to salvation. This is the way to God. Whereas the direction, that's what we say. In discipleship, we don't just say, this is the way. We say, hey, come and go with me. Let's go on the way together. Let's do this together. As I'm headed that way, I need a buddy. I need a partner. I need a crew. Will you come with me? The key difference between direction and discipleship is relationship. It's proximity. It's intimacy. And it's this commitment to spend time in loving friendship with somebody else. The third thing that we see in Jesus' example of how he made disciples is that it was formational. Right? Everything he did was about forming them into something else, forming them into ultimately who God created them to be. And for this, I want to go back to the verse for just a second because this is where one of the Bible translations kind of makes it difficult to understand. I typically use what's known as the Christian Standard Bible on a Sunday morning. I never kind of put it down here, but if you want to know which one I'm using, it's the CSB, all right? And I think it's great. In fact, it's my preferred to teach from, which makes sense. It's one I choose, right? But it's not perfect. And no translation is, by the way, King James or ESV. I know they got some strong proponents. They're not perfect, all right? So let's just all kind of agree together that we're going to pick one and we're going to go with it. But here's a place where I think it gets it wrong. Because this particular phrase, I will make you. Now listen, I'm a dad. I make my son brush his teeth. I make my son take showers. I make my son say please and thank you, right? And if I say, I will make you fish for people, I read this as Jesus says, hey, I'm going to force you to do something. Or I'm going to very strongly encourage you to do something. But that's not what he says at all. And this is where I think the ESV gets it right. And the NLT, by the way, says, I'm going to show you how, which is another great way of translating. This particular phrase, I will make you, is the Greek phrase poiao. Okay? And poiao, what it means, it's like a potter with clay. It's forming something from one substance into another. It's making something out of something else. And so what he says is, I'm going to form you. I'm going to shape you. You're going to come do life with me. And if you follow me and come and have this access to me, I'm going to turn you into one who then can go fish for people. You're going to help rescue, redeem, and restore the image of God in other people in a way that you are not currently equipped to do that. That is Jesus' picture of discipleship. That is his model, that it's formational. It's not just about being a friend. It's not just about spending time. It's the intent to form one into someone who's more like Christ and prepared to do the same in the life of others. He took every opportunity, just like my dad did with me, every chance to form me into something, to teach me new things. That's what Jesus did in the life of his disciples. Think about all the things that these people saw Jesus do. Jesus often would go off and pray. We've talked about that before. But you know how many times when we see where it says Jesus went off and prayed that he had invited his disciples to go do that? Think what it must have been like to hear Jesus pray. I mean, I love listening to Dr. Weeks pray. I love listening to Matt pray. I'm seriously encouraged by listening to people on our team pray. It inspires me. It encourages me. Because I get, you just get the slightest bit of insight, right, into their relationship with God. I don't know everything about it, but it reminds me that these are genuine people with genuine faiths. But imagine what it must have been like to hear Jesus pray. Because he's talking to God like it's his real dad. But he's also the same. He also knows he's been sent on a mission. That must have been the most transformative eavesdropping ever. Think about the conversations they must have had. We don't have every conversation recorded in the Gospels. Think about all the conversations they must have had, all the questions they asked. Think about the situations they saw Jesus go through when he was confronted by the Pharisees and the religious leaders of the day and how he had to deal with conflict and the things that made Jesus sad and the things that made Jesus mad. I mean, they watched him flip tables. I think about some of the different stories, and I think about what it must have been like to be a disciple when Jesus comes and says, hey, it's getting dark, these people are hungry, I need you to find out a way to feed them. They weren't just like there to have access, they were invited in to do ministry with him. They were invited to live. Like in that particular story, he puts the responsibility back on the disciples to come up with a way of feeding 5,000 people. And they're thinking to myself, like, we got one kid that brought a sack lunch here, boss. Like, what exactly are we supposed to do? And he's just like, I can work with that, just watch. And so they got to be firsthand participants in this miracle and see it, and they got the experience of being used by God to feed the crowds and have excess left over. Think about what it must have been like to be a disciple who wanted to keep the children away when Jesus was like, you're going to let the children come to me, right? Luke chapter 18. All these parents are coming, I want my kids to be blessed by Jesus. I want them to spend time with Jesus. And the disciples, for whatever reason, are like, I don't want Jesus to be bothered with these kids. You know? Like some of you feel, why you won't volunteer next door. You know, I mean, like, I don't want to be bothered with kids. You know? And so what does Jesus say? Guys, you got it wrong. What must it have been like to be corrected by Jesus? Right? To be told, like, hey, you got the wrong idea. Like, let me bring those children to me. Let me tell you, these kids, they got it right. Like, they come just with reckless abandon, just surrendering to me. They are in awe of who I am. That's what you should be like, right? Think about, like, when Zacchaeus is coming down out of the tree, and Jesus is like, hey, we're going to come to your house for dinner. And the disciples are like, we're going where? You know, like, where are we going for dinner? Like, this is crazy, Jesus. Like, people were already mad at us. Like, we're on our way to Jerusalem for the final time here. What's going on? Jesus' style of discipleship, again, it was all about rescuing people, redeeming people, and restoring the image of God in them so that God may get the glory that was lived out through their life. He wanted them to become who he created them to be. And that's the posture that we take. That as we live our life and give ourselves a platform to provide direction, we then have the opportunity to build relationships with people. And through doing life with us, we invite them to do life with us. And hopefully God uses us to lead them to a place of repentance and salvation. And they come to know Jesus personally like we know Jesus personally. But then we don't just be like, all right, you found Jesus, I'm going to pass you off to someone else. Then we get to invite them even deeper and say, hey, I'm still figuring out this Jesus thing. You want to do it with me? Let me show you what I've learned. Maybe you'll teach me a few things along the way. And all of this makes me think, like, what do we do with, like, responsibilities like these? What do we do with this sacred responsibility that we have to make disciples? To be a disciple is to be a disciple maker, Jesus says. And it begs the question, are you making any disciples right now? Like, is there anyone that you have shown intentionality with the way Jesus did? Is there anyone that you've actually had a conversation? Like, listen, man, like, you seem like you could use some help. And I don't mean that in the negative way. Like, you've asked a ton of questions, and I think maybe I'm not perfect, but I'd love just to spend some time with you to help you become more like Jesus. Would you be open to something like that? Have you been clear with your intentions? Have you been relational? Have you taken the time to commit to somebody else? Have you invited them into your life? Do you realize that everything you do is an opportunity to invite someone in? Like, every trip to the grocery store you make, if you have kids, is an opportunity for discipleship. You're like, I want to leave my kids at home with my husband or my wife. Like, the grocery store is not the place. And if there's any place where you're like, that's not the place, that might be the place. Especially for me at a grocery store, because it's a frustrating thing. And my kids, maybe they hold me accountable, maybe they make me a better person, but they're going to see me navigate the list that their mom has made, not knowing where half the things are. You know what I'm saying? Those are opportunities. Hey, I got to get my oil changed. Will you come with me? Will you pick me up? Will you drop me off? Can we do this together? There's some things I got to do. Will you come with me? Are you finding opportunities? Are you making this a priority? And if you're not making disciples, why not? But even better yet, a disciple is never going to become greater than his teacher. Who have you invited to disciple you? Have you gone out of your way to say, hey, I could use some help in this? Would you meet with me once a week? Would you share with me some insight? Can we study a book of the Bible together? Can we read a book together? Can we grab coffee? Can we get our oil changed? Can we go grocery shopping? There's so many opportunities, but it takes a proactive decision to say, I want to be discipled and I want to make disciples. And dads, this is huge. I feel the weight. I'm a dad. There's so many things that I feel responsible for teaching my kids. From learning how to, personal hygiene, riding their bike, driving a car, making friends, navigating conflict, picking somebody to date, heaven forbid, one day. I mean, there's so many things, right? All the things that we have to teach pale in comparison to this most important thing, that loving the Lord our God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength is the most important thing. And it's the words we say, and it's the time we say to be very direct, but it's also the way that we live our life. There's nothing more important than the way they see you live your life of faith will be the most influential part of them developing that for themselves. All the other stuff is going to come with time. All the other stuff is going to fall into place. Focus on the relationship you have with those that you have the responsibility for forming, and focus on Jesus so that as you're forming them, they're becoming more like who you're becoming more like. But know this, every day you are teaching them something. You see, I think disciples are handcrafted. I don't think we can mass produce disciples. I don't think this is necessarily the prime environment for making disciples. I understand discipleship is the central task of the church, but I don't think it's large group settings. I don't think it's kids ministry or student ministry. I think it's relationship. That's what Jesus demonstrated. That's what he encouraged us to do. And listen, I've got room for improvement in this. As a disciple maker myself, I need to find more people to pour into my life so that I can be more effective in making disciples of those around me, of my children and of others. And I think as a church, we've got room to improve in this area. Like to better equip you to do this, to encourage you, to give you more opportunities, but also to connect you with people. And maybe to nudge you out of your comfort zone just a little bit, to find people on both sides of this relationship, to both help you and for those for you to help. But my hope is that through this series, through understanding that direction, discipline, and yes, discipleship are built into the fabric of the family and the church as a family, my hope is that this might be the beginning of a new, better chapter for your family, for our church, and for your life. Will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for today. I thank you for the opportunity you've given us to dive into your word, to learn from the model and the life of Jesus, to see him not only as our ultimate goal of formation to be more like, but also, God, as the paradigm and the model for a life lived well, a life that lives to invest in the lives of others, to form others, and to help them become more like you. Father, I pray that you would walk alongside us, that you'd be very clear in showing us how we can improve and give us the confidence and desire to get better at this, so that ultimately, God, the fruit of our lives would be a generation after another generation of not just disciples and followers, but of disciple makers, those who have come to know you and love you and follow you and feel that responsibility and have the equipping to reproduce that faith in the life of others. I thank you for the family. I thank you for this church family. And I thank you for your love. In Jesus' name I pray.